The doctor needed a wife by sundown to keep his practice. A stranger volunteered. The letter came on a Tuesday, which is how I remember it wasn't a dream. Dreams don't arrive on Tuesdays. Dreams don't smell like whatever the postal rider had been eating, some kind of pickled fish smell that got on the envelope and stayed there even after I'd read the thing 3 times standing in the middle of my examination room with the morning light coming low through the east window and laying yellow bars across the floor. The letter was from the territorial board. 5 men in Cheyenne who had never seen Morrow Flat and would not have been caught dead in it. The letter said, and I'm going to try to get this right because I've said it to myself enough times that it ought to be word perfect by now. The letter said that, in light of the recent passage of the Municipal Stability and Practice Act, all medical licenses issued in unincorporated territories were to be reviewed, and that practitioners operating without the establishment of a proper household, defined as including a lawful spouse, would be considered itinerant practitioners rather than settled ones, and that itinerant practitioners operating in unincorporated territory without a county charter endorsement would need to reapply, and that reapplication had been suspended pending review, and that review would not commence until the following spring. The spring, it was October. What they were saying, in the language men use when they want to do something small and crooked and not have anyone say it plain, was this: get married or get out. Get yourself a wife by the 1st of November or we pull your license and you can go practice medicine somewhere else, somewhere that has already chartered you, which is to say nowhere, because I had only ever practiced in Morrow Flat and the surrounding 20 miles of grass and ridge and creek bottom, and that was the only endorsement I had and the only one I'd ever wanted. I set the letter on my instrument tray. Next to the tray was a jar of sheep gut suture I'd been sterilizing and a pair of extraction forceps that needed oiling. It occurred to me to throw the letter at the wall, but the wall was just whitewashed planking, and it wouldn't have made any sound worth the gesture. So I folded it back along its creases and put it in my coat pocket and went back to work. I want to be clear about something. I'm not telling this story because it ended badly. I'm telling it because I was 61 years old when that letter arrived, and I had been alone for 11 years, and I had stopped expecting anything different. You get to a point where you stop expecting, and it isn't even sad anymore. It's just the shape of the day. You get up and you make coffee and you see patients and you eat whatever you've got and you read until the lamp gets low and you sleep and you do it again. The loneliness is still there. But it's familiar loneliness. You know where it sits. What that letter did was not make me angry about losing my license, or not only that. What it did was remind me that I had nothing it could take, which is a different feeling and a worse one. I should tell you about Morrow Flat so you understand what kind of place a man ends up in at 61, with nothing it can take. It is 22 buildings. That's all 22, and 6 of them are sheds. A general store, a livery, a post house, a saloon, the Methodist church that Reverend Grubb has been promising to replace for 9 years and hasn't, my office which is also where I live, and the rest houses and sheds and one building that used to be a hotel and is now where a family named Pelcher stores their winter feed. The population shifts. Summer it might run to 140 souls if you count the drovers coming through. Winter it drops to about 60, and some of those 60 spend the coldest months doing their best to kill themselves with whiskey and bad judgment, which is at least steady work for me. I had been there since 1871. I came after my wife, Catherine, died. She died of a fever that I couldn't break. I was a doctor and I could not break my own wife's fever, and she died on a Wednesday morning in September in our house in Laramie while I was sitting next to her holding her hand and not being able to do one damn useful thing. After that, I couldn't be in Laramie. Couldn't be in a place where people knew who I was and what I hadn't been able to do. So I came to Morrow Flat, where nobody knew me and the nearest doctor was 60 miles south, and I set up my office and I started over. I was good at the work. I want to say that without it sounding like I'm puffed up about it. I was good at it because I gave it everything I had and I had made it my life's replacement for the life I'd lost. The people of Morrow Flat knew it. They'd ride through weather to get to me. They'd trust me with their children. That's not a small thing. But nobody ever said it to my face except in the way people thank a smithy for shoeing their horse, appreciative but not personal. Not like you're valuing the man. Like you're valuing the service, which is fair. That's what I was providing. I didn't resent it. I'm telling you this straight. I'd made my peace with being the town's instrument and not its companion. I ate alone and I slept alone, and the only thing in my house that was there for me, rather than for my patients, was a shelf of books, Dickens mostly, and some Twain, and a natural history of birds that Catherine had given me before she got sick, and that I couldn't throw away even after 11 years. That's the man I was when the letter came. Useful, alone, 61 years old, decent at what I did and invisible outside of it. I thought about it for 3 days, and then I did the only practical thing I could think of. I wrote to the board and told them I was in the process of arranging the matter, and asked for a 2-week extension to confirm the arrangement. Then I went to see Greta Foss, who ran the post house and was the most sensible woman in Morrow Flat, and I told her what the letter said, and I asked her if she knew of any widow in the territory who might want a settled situation and didn't have strong feelings about romance. Greta stared at me for a good 5 seconds. She had a way of looking at you when she thought you were being stupid that didn't involve her face changing much. Just her eyes getting a little distant, like she was calculating something you'd said, and the result kept coming out wrong. "You want me to find you a wife," she said. "I want you to help me find a suitable arrangement." "Elias," she said, "that's my name, Elias Quarter, that's the same thing." "It's practical," I said. "It's not romantic, but it's practical. I'm not looking for, I just need somebody who wants a house and a settled life and is willing to be listed on a certificate. They can have the back room. I won't bother them." Greta gave me that look again. Then she said, "I'll ask around." And the way she said it made me feel like a fool, which was probably appropriate. She asked around. A week went by. Nobody local had any interest in the arrangement, which didn't surprise me. The women of Morrow Flat who were unattached had opinions about me that were either too clinical or too close. I was their doctor. It's a particular kind of knowing, and it doesn't lend itself to matrimony. What Greta came back with, after a week of asking, was a name she'd gotten from a woman in Bitter Creek, who'd gotten it from a freight hauler who'd been to Rawlins, which is how information traveled in that country. The name was Agnes Combe. The freight hauler said she was a widow around 50 who'd been trying to find work in Rawlins since her husband died and wasn't having much luck, and that she was reportedly a steady woman, educated enough to read and write, and that she might be interested in a settled situation. No guarantees, just a possibility. I wrote to Rawlins, a forwarded address, so the letter would take a week each way at least if it got there at all. I told Greta I'd written, and she said good and gave me that look, and I went back to my practice and tried not to think about any of it. What I thought about instead was the 1st of November. It was October 10th, 3 weeks. There were a lot of patients that October. There was a respiratory illness moving through the valley from somewhere south. Not serious, mostly coughs and fevers that broke in a few days, but there was enough of it that I was making house calls every other day and sometimes sleeping on people's floors so I could check on a child in the night. I don't tell you that to complain about it. I tell you because when I'm busy like that, truly busy in a way that requires all of me, the loneliness goes quiet for a while. The days have a shape and a purpose that isn't about what I have or don't have. It's just, this person needs help. That one too, get to work. The Haverson boy was the worst of it that October. 7 years old, croup so severe his lips had gone a bad color by the time they got him to me. I spent the better part of 2 nights with him, steam treatments every few hours, keeping him calm because fear makes the breathing worse, and the breathing was already bad enough. His mother stayed with him too. She was a practical woman, Martha Haverson. She didn't wring her hands, and she didn't collapse, and she didn't pepper me with questions I couldn't answer. She just stayed close to her son and did what I told her and trusted me to do the rest. By the second morning, the color was better. By the third day, he was eating a little. By the end of the week, he was outside throwing rocks at the Haverson dog, which was how you knew he was well. His father shook my hand when I came for the last check. Hard, two-handed, didn't say much. He was not a man who said much, but the way he gripped my hand said it. That's what the work was like. You couldn't carry it out of the room with you, not the gratitude, not the relief, not the close call, because the next case was already waiting. But somewhere in the accumulation of it over 11 years, there was a weight to it, a rightness. This was what I was for, and I was good at it, and whatever else I'd lost and whatever else was missing, this was mine. I held on to that. It's the evenings that are hard. The evenings when the last patient has gone and the office is clean and the instruments are put away, and there's nothing between me and the silence but a lamp and whatever Dickens I'm on. I don't drink. I tried drinking after Catherine died. It makes the evenings shorter, but it makes the mornings worse, and the mornings are already bad enough. The reply from Rollins came on October 19th. It wasn't from Agnes Combe. It was from the boarding house where she'd been staying, and it said that Mrs. Combe had left Rollins 3 weeks prior, and her destination was not known. So that was that. I sat with the letter for a while. Then I did the arithmetic. 12 days until the 1st of November. The road to Cheyenne was 4 days each way in October, longer if weather came in. The board wasn't going to extend again. The nearest alternative posting for a doctor my age with my credentials was Denver, if there was one, and I'd have to find out and get hired and establish myself, and do all of it while my license here was lapsing, and I had no practice income and no particular recommendation, except that I'd kept a small Wyoming town alive for 11 years without killing anybody I shouldn't have. I went to bed and I lay there for a long time looking at the ceiling and listening to the wind coming down off the ridge, which has a particular sound in October, very dry and high, like the country is breathing out after holding it all summer. I thought about leaving. I thought about whether I could do it, pack the instruments and the books and get on a horse and not look back. I'd done it once. After Catherine, I knew the mechanics of it. You make a list. You pack what fits. You leave before you can change your mind. The body knows how to go through those motions even when the mind is not sure where it's going. What I didn't know anymore was whether I had another starting over in me. At 61, with nothing to start toward. It's a different calculation than it was at 50 or at 45. At those ages, you can still believe that the next place will be better or at least different, that the distance between here and there carries some possibility in it. At 61, you know that you carry yourself with you, and that the distance doesn't change much of what matters. The ridge wind came and went. I listened to the building settle. I thought about the Haverson boy and about the Brenner family and about old Tom Witzel, who came to me every 3 months for his joints and who always brought me a jar of his wife's preserved peaches, which I didn't especially like but ate because the giving of them meant something. These were the things I'd built, not grand, not what I'd imagined at 25 when I was learning medicine and thinking about the life it would give me, but real, mine. And I was not sure I could leave them without losing the last thing I had left. I didn't reach any conclusion. I just fell asleep, which the body sometimes does when the mind has gotten somewhere it can't manage. She arrived on the 21st. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know she was anyone in particular. I was coming out of the Haverson place on the south side of town, having spent the better part of the morning with their youngest who'd had a croup that needed steaming. And I was walking back up the main street with my bag and my coat open because the sun was out, and it was one of those October days in Wyoming that's almost generous, where the light is yellow and the air has some give in it, and I saw her. She was standing outside the general store with a travel bag at her feet and a coat that had seen too many winters, and she was looking up the street with the expression of a person taking stock. Not uncertain, not lost, just looking, like she was deciding where to start. I noticed her the way you notice most things in Morrow Flat, which is completely, because there's so little else to notice. She was, I guessed, somewhere in her middle 40s. Dark hair going gray at the temples, pulled back without much fuss. A jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a long time and hadn't let it win. She was not small and she was not soft-looking. There was a solidness to her, the kind that doesn't come from size but from having absorbed a certain amount and stayed upright through it. She had that particular kind of stillness that some people have who have been through enough that they've stopped flinching at things. I would have walked past. I had patience to see and instruments to re-sterilize, and a note to write to a man in Cheyenne who wasn't going to care what it said. But she turned and looked at me and she said, "Are you the doctor?" I stopped. "I am." "Then you're who I'm looking for," she said. "My name is Nell Hargrove. I got your letter." I didn't know what she was talking about. "I think," I said, "there may be some confusion. I wrote to a woman named Agnes Combe," she said. "Agnes is my cousin. She left Rawlins to come here, at least that was her plan, and she asked me to come instead because she got a situation in Casper that she couldn't pass up. I wrote you a letter, but I may have beaten it here." She paused. She looked at me with that assessment in her eyes, the kind you feel on your skin, but without the pity you sometimes get with assessment. It was the look of a person deciding something, taking the measure of the facts. "If you'd rather wait for Agnes, I can head back. But you're running short on time from what she told me of the situation." I stood in the middle of the main street of Morrow Flat in the October sun, and I tried to think of something to say that wasn't idiotic. "I have a spare room," I said finally, "if you want to come look at the arrangement before you decide." She picked up her bag. "All right," she said. That was the first conversation. That was how it started. I showed her the back room, which was small and had a window that faced west and got the afternoon light, and a bed that was adequate and a chest of drawers I'd made myself years ago out of pine badly. She looked at the room. Then she walked back out and looked at the rest of the office, the examination table and the instrument cabinet and the shelves of medicines and the work table where I wrote my notes. And she took it all in with a slow turn, not saying anything, just taking it in. Then she said, "You're tidy." "I have to be," I said. "In this work. I mean the whole place, not just the medical part." I didn't know what to say to that. There was something in the way she said it that wasn't quite a compliment and wasn't quite an observation, like she was noting something about a person, not a room. I offered her coffee and she said yes, and I made it on the small stove in the back corner that doubled as my kitchen when I could call it that, and we sat at the workbench I used for writing, and she put her hands around the cup the way cold people do, even when they're not that cold, just needing the warmth of the shape of it, and she told me about herself. She had been married to a man named Robert Hargrove, a cattleman in New Mexico Territory, who died 4 years prior in a horse accident, not romantic. She said, no outlaws, just a horse that spooked at something and him not ready for it. They'd had no children. She'd managed the ranch alone for 2 years after he died, which she could do because she knew the work. But then 2 bad winters in a row had finished it, and she'd sold what was left and come north to her cousin in Rawlins to figure out what came next. She said all of this without any performance of hardship. Just, this is what happened. She was not asking for anything. She was not showing me the weight of her situation and waiting for me to feel it. She was telling me the relevant facts so I could make an informed decision. There was a kind of respect in that, I thought. She assumed I didn't need the emotional context, just the information. "You don't have to do this," I said. "Marry a stranger for a license." She looked at me. She had gray eyes, not cold, just direct. The kind of direct that's become so habitual the person doesn't even know anymore how unusual it is. I know that, she said. I'm doing it because it's a practical solution to a practical problem. You need a wife on paper by the 1st of November and I need a settled situation. That's a fair exchange. It doesn't seem fair to you, I said. Why not? Because I get the most out of it. I keep my practice. You get a room and an association with a man you don't know. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her coffee. Then she looked at me. A room and a steady income and a place where I can be useful. That's not nothing. That's more than I've had for 4 years. 4 years of managing. Managing it wears on you. After a while you want to matter somewhere specific. To be part of something that runs. She said it the way she said everything. Without inflation. These were the terms and she'd assessed them and found them acceptable. I had the strange feeling of being assessed fairly, which is rarer than it sounds. Most people either overvalue you or undervalue you, depending on what they need from you. She appeared to be trying to see me exactly as I was. I said all right, she said good. We agreed to it that afternoon. I would arrange the legal registration. There was a justice of the peace 30 miles east in Kinney Crossing who could do the paperwork. I told her she could take as much time as she needed to decide if the arrangement suited her. She said she'd already decided. I said all right again. She put her bag in the back room. I went back to my patients. What I didn't expect was that she'd be useful immediately. Not romantically. I want to be careful here, because the next thing I say will sound like I'm building towards something warm, and I am, but not in a hurry and not falsely. What I mean is she was useful the way a second pair of competent hands is useful. The way a person who sees what needs doing and does it without being asked is useful. The croup was still working through the valley. On her second day in Morrow Flat I had 3 house calls to make, and she asked if she could come. I wasn't sure why she asked, but I said yes. At the first house, the Brenner place, she took one look at the child 3 years old, struggling to breathe, scared in the way small children are scared when their bodies aren't working right, which is a complete and terrifying fear because they don't have the vocabulary for it yet. And she sat down next to her on the bed and started talking to her quietly about nothing in particular, about a dog she'd once had, about something she'd seen in the road that morning that was funny. The child's breathing steadied just from being less scared, not cured, just calmer, which makes the treatment easier. I noted it. She didn't say anything about it. At the second house she helped me with the steaming, holding a towel over a pot of water so the child could breathe the vapor. And she did it exactly right, the right distance and the right angle, the tent of towel neither too close nor too loose. She'd learned it somewhere. When I asked her where, she said she'd raised 2 of her husband's sister's children for a year when his sister was sick, and she'd learned most of what she needed to learn in that year. She said it the way she said everything. Matter of fact, no inflation. This is what happened. Here is what I learned from it. At the third house, old Winifred Cass, who was 81 and had the respiratory illness on top of a chest that was already fragile, Nell sat with her while I examined her, and she did something I watched with attention. She held Winifred's hand. Not performatively, not with the manner some people use that's really more for themselves than for the person they're tending. She just held it loosely and didn't let go, and Winifred's shoulders, which had been up around her ears, came down by a fraction. When we were walking back, I said, "Winifred is going to be all right. The illness isn't as advanced as I feared." "I know," she said. I looked at her. "How did you know?" "Her color," she said, "and the quality of her cough. It's loose, not the dry kind. The dry kind holds on." I looked at her for another moment. "Where did you learn that?" "Same year," she said, and that was all. By the end of those 3 calls, she was anticipating what I'd need before I reached for it. Not every time. She didn't know my instruments yet, didn't know my habits, but often enough that I noticed it as a pattern and not a coincidence. That evening when we got back, I set my bag down and she made coffee again without being asked, and I sat down, and I was more tired than I usually was after a day like that, because the day had been longer than usual, and I'd spent some of it conscious of being witnessed, which takes more out of a person than working alone. I said I didn't plan to say this, it just came out, "You're good at this." She set the cups down and looked at me. Good at what? Being with sick people, making them less afraid. She thought about that. I don't know if it's a skill, she said. I think it's just that I've been sick and scared. And when you've been both of those things, you know what a person needs, and it isn't always medicine. I didn't say anything. She sat down across from me with her cup, and we drank our coffee in the quiet that had developed between us over 2 days, which was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was just two people who didn't need to fill silence with noise. Later I thought, when was the last time I had sat with someone in a quiet that wasn't lonely? I couldn't remember. I went to bed and I thought about it, and I still couldn't remember, and that should have told me something. But I was still at the point where I was not letting myself think about what things told me. The wedding was on October 28th. Justice of the Peace in Kinney Crossing was a man named Earl Sutter, who had a potbelly and a walrus mustache, and an office that smelled permanently of pipe smoke and wet dog. We rode out there in the morning, Nell and I, on 2 horses I'd borrowed from the livery because I kept no animals of my own. It was a cold morning, clear, one of those mornings where the sky looks scrubbed and the distance has detail in it that you can't usually see, ridge lines and draws you don't normally make out, all of it sharp as cut glass. We didn't talk much on the ride out. She was not a person who needed to fill a journey with conversation, which suited me. We rode and I looked at the country, and she did too, and once she pointed to a hawk riding a thermal over the eastern draw and said, "What kind is that?" And I told her it was a ferruginous hawk, one of the big ones, the largest boodio in North America, and she said, "I didn't know you knew birds." And I told her about Catherine's book, about the natural history, how I'd had it for 11 years and hadn't been able to part with it even after everything. And she listened without asking more than she needed to, and then we rode some more in quiet. There was a moment on the ride, I don't know exactly where, somewhere in the middle stretch where the road dips and then rises and you can see a long way in both directions, where I was aware of her beside me on the horse and aware of what we were about to do, and I had a feeling I hadn't had in a very long time. Not excitement. Something quieter than excitement. Something like, you are here and it is morning and the country is showing itself in the cold light and you are not alone. I noted it and put it away. In Sutter's office it took about 12 minutes. He read the words and we said the words and he wrote down the names and I paid his fee, which was $2, and that was the marriage. Sutter shook my hand and looked at Nell with the look men sometimes give women in these situations, a kind of inventory, assessing what a man had gotten or settled for, and Nell looked back at him with that direct gray gaze, and he moved on quickly to something else. On the ride home, she said, "He seemed disappointed for you." "Sutter's disappointed about everything," I said. "His life didn't turn out the way he planned." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Did yours?" I thought about it. I didn't give her the reflex answer. I thought about it honestly. "No," I said. "I planned on dying before Catherine. I always assumed I would. She was the one who took care of things. I was going to be the one who got sick." She nodded, just that. Just a nod, like she understood the full weight of it without needing me to unpack it. "Robert was the same," she said after a while. "He was supposed to be the steady one. I was supposed to be the one who worried." She paused. "He never worried about a single thing in his life. That was part of what got him killed." We rode the rest of the way in quiet, and I thought about that. About the plans you make that don't account for the actual shape of things. About the people you build your plans around, and what happens to the plans when those people are gone. We rode back into Morrow Flat in the early afternoon, and we had soup that she'd made before we left and left warming on the low burner, which I hadn't expected. And we sat and ate it and neither of us said anything about what had just happened or what it was. And after a while she went to the back room to write a letter to Agnes, and I went to check on the Haverson child, who was improving, and that was the 28th of October. I sent the documentation to the board that afternoon by express rider. There was nothing to do then but wait. While I waited for their confirmation, the days continued. What I discovered in those days was something I had forgotten, or maybe something I'd never learned correctly, which is what it means to have another person in a space. Not company in the social sense, not visitors or patients, but a person who belongs in the same walls as you, who has a particular place for her coat, the third peg from the door, not the first or second, always the third, and a particular cup she prefers in the morning, and a particular way of going quiet when she's thinking something through, which involves her looking at the middle distance with her head tilted slightly as if she's hearing something at a frequency I can't quite catch. She was not demanding. She did not require anything from me except the practical arrangement, the room, the income, the association. She helped with the patients because she wanted to help, and it was useful, not because she thought I needed her help. She cooked on alternate nights and I cooked on alternate nights, which she proposed as a division and which was sensible. On my nights I made what I knew how to make, which was not very varied. On her nights the meals were different. She used things I had in the pantry that I'd never thought to combine, and the result was food that tasted like someone had thought about it, which is not something I'd had in a long time. She read in the evenings. She had a leather satchel that she'd brought from Rawlins, and it was full of books. Not Dickens, she told me. She found Dickens exhausting, but Darwin and a Spanish history of the New Mexico territory, and a survey of native plants that she used to identify what she saw when she walked, which she did every morning before the day started, regardless of weather. I asked her once about the Spanish history. She said Robert had spoken some Spanish, that she'd picked it up in New Mexico over the years, that she liked reading it because it forced her to go slowly and pay attention to each word. I said I'd always wanted to learn a second language and never had. She said it wasn't too late, and I said I was 61, and she said that was not a reason. She said things like that, not unkindly, just directly, as if my age and my solitude and my settled habits were not fixed facts but things I'd decided and could undecide. It was slightly unsettling and also something else, something I couldn't name at first. Then I named it. It felt like being taken seriously, not as the town's doctor, as a person who still had choices. The board's confirmation came on November 7th. 3 paragraphs. License reinstated. Household status acknowledged, period of review concluded. I sat with it and felt the thing I'd been holding in my chest for 4 weeks release all at once, which was not dramatic, just a long breath out and a kind of quiet. She was in the back room when the letter came. I went to the doorway. The board confirmed it, I said. She looked up from her book. She saw something in my face. I don't know what, I'm not good at knowing what my face does, and she said, good. Just that. And then, you were afraid you'd lose it. I was afraid of starting over, I said. She held my gaze for a moment. I know that feeling, she said. And she did. She said it the way a person says something they know from the inside, not from observation. She'd started over, multiple times in different ways, and here she was in a small back room in a 22-building town in Wyoming, because this was where the starting over had landed her, and she had set down her bag and gone to work, and not complained about any of it. I said thank you, she said you're welcome. And then she went back to her book, and I went back to my instruments, and the evening came down around the town. I want to tell you about the first time I understood what I was feeling. It was November, sometime in the middle of it. The respiratory illness had passed through, and we were in that period between the last of autumn and the real start of winter where the work is lighter, the urgent cases fewer, and the days are short and the nights are long and cold and full of quiet. She had started helping me in the examination room, Not with every patient, some patients wouldn't have it, the older men especially, who had ideas about privacy that I respected, but with most. And she was good. Not just with the making less afraid, which she'd been good at from the start, but with the practical skills. She could take a pulse and time it and tell me the quality of it, not just the rate. She could hold a wound closed while I sutured it and not flinch and not tighten her grip when it must have cost her something not to. She could get accurate information out of a frightened patient because she asked questions the way she lived plainly, without making them feel worse for being scared. I had been teaching her some, and she'd been learning the way a person learns who is already well equipped and just needs the specific vocabulary. She was not playing at it. She was doing it. And she was keeping a journal, descriptions of cases, observations, outcomes, in a plain notebook she'd bought at the general store. She'd started it on her own without my suggestion, and I thought it was a better idea than I'd ever had, and I told her so, and she said she'd done something like it during that year with the children, a habit from then. On this particular evening we'd had a difficult case. A man named Harkin, from a homestead north of town, who'd come in with a cut on his forearm that had gone septic. He'd waited too long. He was feverish and the redness had spread up past his elbow, and the look in his eye was the look of a man who's scared in the quiet way, past words. We cleaned it and drained it, which was not easy and which he bore without making a sound, though the sound the drainage made was bad enough on its own. She held the lamp and then held him steady, both hands on his shoulders while I worked. Not restraining, steadying. There's a difference and it matters, and she understood the difference without being told. I dosed him with what I had for the fever, and we got him settled in the examination room on a cot I kept for cases that couldn't travel. She sat with him for the first part of the night so I could sleep, and then woke me at 2 in the morning so she could sleep. I sat with him through the gray hours before dawn, which are the worst hours in a sick room, when the darkness feels permanent, and the fever always seems to spike, and I kept watch and kept the fever down and thought about the man's wife out on the homestead, not knowing where he was or what had happened. He came through. By morning the fever was lower and the redness was receding. At mid-morning Nell brought him broth from the kitchen and told him, in a tone that allowed no argument, that he would stay one more day, and that she was going to send word to his wife. He said his wife would worry. She said his wife was already worrying. The only question was whether she was going to worry for a reason or for nothing. He stayed. His wife came at midday, a short, red-faced woman who came through the door like she'd been driving herself hard for hours, which she had, and she looked at her husband on the cot, and she looked at me, and she looked at Nell, and she said, voice flat with held-back feeling, "Is he going to be all right?" And it was Nell who answered. "Yes," she said. "He's going to be fine. Sit down. Let me get you some water." The woman sat down and Nell got the water and I watched it and thought, she has become something here. Or not, she'd been this all along. She'd just been without a place to put it. After he left, I was cleaning up the examination room, and she was at the workbench writing notes in the journal, her pen moving steadily across the page. And I looked at her there, with the afternoon light coming through the window and making her gray-streaked hair silver, and I knew what I was feeling. I stood in the middle of my examination room with a handful of used cloths, and I knew. I was in love with her, not the frantic kind, not the kind I'd had for Catherine at 24, which had been wild and specific and consuming. This was the kind that comes later if you're lucky enough to have a later, the kind that feels like recognition. Like you've been looking at something for weeks that your eye had classified as familiar landscape, and then one afternoon the light changes, and you see that it's a face and you have been looking at it the whole time. I didn't say anything. I wasn't ready to say anything. I didn't know if she felt anything remotely like it, and I wasn't going to make something hard out of something that was, at present, working very well. So I took the cloths to the wash tub and I got them soaking, and I went back in and I asked her about the notes she was keeping, and we talked about that for a while, and the evening came. The first snow came in late November. In Morrow Flat, the first real snow is not like the first light snows of October that come and go. This is the one that means it. It comes in overnight, and in the morning the world is white and the temperature has dropped 15 degrees, and the silence is total and absolute and particular. That snow silence that is not quiet so much as muffled, everything wrapped and padded and turned inward. I was up before dawn, old habit. I lit the stove and put the coffee on, and I pulled on my coat and went outside to see it, the way I always do with the first real snow, just to take the measure of it. It was mid-calf in the street and still coming, slow and steady, the big flakes that mean the storm will be long. The sky was the color of pewter, and the single lamp post at the end of the street was making a circle of amber in the dark, and the snow fell through it in a way that would have been pretty if you weren't also thinking about who might need to get through it on a horse. I came back inside and she was up. She'd heard me, or she was already awake. She was at the stove, had gotten the coffee further along than I'd left it, and she looked at me over her shoulder when I came in and said, "Bad." "Deep," I said, "still coming." She nodded and got down 2 cups, the blue one for herself, because she'd settled on the blue 1 week ago and I'd stopped using it out of habit, the brown one for me. We stood in the kitchen corner drinking coffee and looking out the small window above the basin at the snow coming down and the gray light coming up slowly over it, not talking, just standing there. After a while she said, "I like the snow. Most people out here don't." "I know I'm not most people out here," she said it simply, no pride in it, just a fact. "In New Mexico it was all heat and dust. I used to dream about snow, real snow, not just a dusting, the kind that changes the whole sound of the world." "You might feel differently by February," I said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, not quite. She didn't laugh easily, but when she did it was real, it was from somewhere. "I might," she said. "Ask me in February." Ask me in February. It was the first future tense thing she'd said to me. The first thing that assumed there was a February to be asked in, with her still there in this kitchen, holding the blue cup. I held that sentence in my chest for the rest of the day, without looking at it directly. That same evening the McAllister boy showed up at the door, 14 years old, 3 miles on foot in the snow. His father had come off the barn roof trying to clear ice and wasn't moving. I went out with him. Nell came without being asked, her coat on before I'd finished putting my bag together. Tom McAllister had a badly broken collarbone and a concussion that had him in and out of consciousness, and we brought him inside and I set the bone, which took both of us, she on one side and me on the other, and she didn't flinch when he came back to consciousness enough to feel what we were doing, and we got him through the night. The boy sat in the corner by the stove and watched us work, and I could see him deciding something, the way young people do when they watch competent adults handle something that terrified them. He was deciding that things could be handled, that the worst thing that had happened today was not the end of it. When we left in the early morning, he stopped me at the door. He was still a boy, but he looked at me like a man trying to get the words right. "Thank you," he said. "That's the job," I said. He shook his head. "Both of you," he said. He looked at Nell. "She talked to Pa when he was scared, made him, I don't know, calmer. He trusts her. She said, 'Your father is a tough man. He'll be on his feet in 6 weeks.'" And the boy looked at her and nodded, and I saw his shoulders drop by about an inch, the last of the held breath going out of him. We walked back through the snow in the early gray light. I thought about the boy's face when she spoke to him, and about the way she'd known, without my telling her, to say that specific thing. Not just that his father would be all right, but that he was a tough man, giving the father his dignity, which is what the boy needed to hear as much as the medical fact. She noticed me looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "I was thinking that you're good at this." "You've said that before." "It's still true," I said. She looked ahead at the street, white and empty in the snow. "So are you," she said, quietly, just that, and we walked the rest of the way home. The winter settled in. I want to try to say what the days were like, because I think that's the part that matters, the accumulation of days and not any single thing that happened. It's the accumulation that changes a person, not the events. The events are just the surface of it. We worked together. She had become, over the weeks, something I couldn't have planned or invented, a real partner in the practice. Not licensed, not formal, not anything the board in Cheyenne would have recognized, but real. She took patient histories with a thoroughness that took me 3 times as long when I did it alone. She noticed things, the quality of a man's color, the way a woman held her arm, the moment a child's breathing changed, that I noticed too, but sometimes only with time, and she noticed immediately, with that animal steady attention she had. We disagreed sometimes. I want to say that too, because it matters. We disagreed about cases and about approaches, and the disagreements were not always comfortable. She thought I was too conservative with pain management, that I underestimated what patients were going through because I was focused on the mechanical problem. I thought she sometimes prioritized the emotional state over the physical in ways that could delay necessary treatment. We argued about it, calmly, the way 2 people argue when they both know the other one has a point. And the combination was better than either of us alone. I started asking her what she observed before I examined a patient, not after. It changed how I worked. She read my books and I read her Darwin, which I found more challenging than I'd expected, and we talked about what we read in the evenings over whatever was on the table. She taught me 20 words of Spanish and corrected me without mercy when I used them wrong. She started with the words for body parts and medications, practical ones, and then branched out into the words you'd need to tell a story. I showed her the bird book and she started adding notations in pencil in the margins. Observations of her own, dates and locations where she'd seen a species, a behavioral note. Small, careful handwriting in the margins of pages I'd never marked. I should have minded because it was Catherine's book and for 11 years I hadn't marked it. But I didn't mind. It felt right. It felt like the book was being used the way books are supposed to be used, held and read and added to, accumulating the attention of more than one life. There were evenings I watched her reading by the lamp and felt something I couldn't name and didn't try to. There were mornings I heard her come back from her walk and stamp the snow off her boots at the door and felt something shift inside my chest that was physical, actual, like a thing that had been tightly held letting go by a fraction. I didn't say anything. She didn't either. Maybe I was wrong about what I felt. Maybe it was just the warmth of not being alone, the simple animal comfort of another person in the same walls, and I was mistaking it for something more specific. Maybe she was comfortable with the arrangement and thought of it exactly as she described it, a settled situation, a fair exchange, a room and a steady income and a place to be useful. Maybe that was all it was for her. I was not going to put her in the position of having to correct me. I kept working. I kept learning her. The 3rd week of December I noticed she always put a single small piece of wood on the fire in the evenings, never 2, and the fire burned lower than I'd have let it. When I mentioned it, she said she'd gotten used to cold rooms in Rawlins, that she actually slept better when it was cold. I started putting 2 pieces on and letting it burn down to 1 by the time she went to bed. She didn't say anything about it. The room was warmer when she was reading and cooler when she slept. That seemed like the right arrangement. I don't know why I'm telling you that detail. I just remember it. When you're learning a person, it's always the small specific things that tell you the most. It was in January that she found me out. I don't say that proudly. I say it because it's what happened. She found me out. There was an evening in the middle of January, deepest winter, the kind of cold that makes the building creak like a ship settling on a wave. I had been to see 3 patients that day, including one that hadn't gone well, a child, 4 years old, pneumonia that had progressed past what I could turn. I had done what I could, and it hadn't been enough, and the parents had sat at the kitchen table with that particular specific silence of people who know what is coming, and there is nothing to say about it. I had ridden home in the dark through cold that had a weight to it, the kind that presses against you from all sides, and I had stabled the horse I'd borrowed and walked back through the empty street and come into the office and taken off my coat, and that was all the motion I had left. I came in and I was not talkative. That's not unusual for me, but I suppose I was further inside myself than usual, in a place I'd learned to go that was private and quiet and removed, where I could manage things without anyone seeing the managing. It's a useful place. You need it in medicine. But I had gotten very good at going there when I didn't need to, when it was just habit, just the door I'd learned to shut so long ago I didn't notice any more when I was shutting it. She looked at me for a long moment without saying anything, not with alarm, just watching me the way she watched things steadily, and then she said, "Do you want to talk about it?" I said no. I said it was a child and it was going badly, and there was nothing to talk about that would change it. She said, "I know, that's not why I asked." I looked at her. She was standing by the stove with a bowl in her hands, completely still, and looking at me with those gray eyes and nothing hidden in them. Not pity. Not the polite concern people perform when they don't know what else to do. Something more straightforward than that. Something like, "I see what you're doing and I'm telling you I see it." "You do this," she said. "When it goes wrong, you go away inside yourself. You've been doing it all winter." I didn't know what to say. I started. "I'm not criticizing you," she said. "I'm telling you what I see, because you're allowed to be sad about a 4-year-old who's got pneumonia. You don't have to put it somewhere private." Something in my chest gave way a little, not dramatically, just the thing I'd been holding loosened, the way a knot loosens after it's been pulled too tight for too long, one strand at a time. I sat down at the workbench. I didn't mean to. My legs just made the decision. She set the bowl down and she came and sat across from me. Not hovering, not performing concern. Just sitting, the way she sat with frightened patients, at the same level, giving them the weight of her presence without asking anything from it. "You've been alone a long time," she said. "Yes. And you got very good at it, at being alone." "I thought I did," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I got good at it too. After Robert, I thought I was doing it well. Managing." She paused. "I was managing, but managing isn't the same as being all right. Managing is just surviving the day, keeping yourself together. It looks like strength from the outside. It isn't." I looked at her. The lamp was low and her face was in the kind of light that doesn't hide things. I said, "Are you all right here, in this arrangement?" She held my gaze. "Yes," she said, "more than I expected to be." "That's not the same as—" "I know what I mean," she said, quietly but firmly, not defensive, certain. "I mean more than I expected. I came here thinking I'd have a room and a purpose and that would be enough. And it is enough. And it's also—" She stopped. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at me, and her eyes were the same as always, direct and gray and steady, but there was something in them I hadn't seen before or hadn't let myself see. "You're a good man, Elias. You're not just good at what you do. You're good in the way that matters, patient, honest, careful with people. Not just your patience, with everyone, with me." She paused. "And I don't think anyone has said that to you in a very long time." I was silent. I didn't trust my voice. "I'm saying it," she said, "because it's true and because it should be said, not because of the arrangement. Because I've been watching you with your patients for 3 months and I've been watching you be alone in this house, and you deserve to have someone see who you are. Not what you do, who you are." The wind came down off the ridge. That sound I knew by heart now. But in winter it's heavier. It comes in gusts that move the building slightly on its foundations. And the lamp wavered, and she was still there across from me, still looking at me with those gray eyes and nothing hidden in them. I reached across the workbench. I put my hand on hers. She looked down at my hand on hers. Then she turned her hand over and held mine, not startled, not hesitant. Like she'd been waiting, not impatiently, but with the settled patience of a person who'd made a decision a while back, and was simply giving the other person time to make theirs. We sat like that for a while, saying nothing, while the winter pressed against the walls and the lamp burned low, and somewhere out in the street the snow was falling again, the soft, relentless kind that piles up by morning. I am not going to try to describe what that felt like. Some things are too specific to a person, too dependent on the particular life that led up to them, to mean much in the telling. What I can say is that it had been 11 years since anyone had held my hand. 11 years since a human being had chosen to hold on to me without needing anything from me in the moment of holding. Not because I was fixing something, not because I was the doctor, just because they wanted to. She held my hand, and I was held. I'm not going to tell you the whole rest of it in detail. Not because it isn't worth telling. Because what happens between two people who decide to be with each other, actually with each other, not as an arrangement but as a choice, is mostly private and ordinary and accumulated in the same way I described before, in small daily things, in the texture of the morning and the evening, in learning someone's silences and their sounds, and what makes them come alive and what they carry when they're tired. What I can tell you is what changed. What changed is that I stopped going away inside myself alone. When something went wrong with a patient, and things went wrong, they always will, that's medicine and that's life, I had somewhere to put it, a person to put it with, not to be rescued from it, not to have it taken away, just to have it witnessed by someone who didn't look away and didn't need me to pretend it was all right when it wasn't. I could say, I lost a child today, and she would say, I know, and that was enough, more than enough. More than I'd had in 11 years. What changed is that she laughed more in February than she had in November, and by March it was frequent enough that I'd started to anticipate it, the way you anticipate something you've come to rely on. It came from somewhere real. It came, often, from things I said that I hadn't known were funny, and I did not mind that discovery at all. It turned out I was occasionally dry in a way that landed, and the audience changed the thing itself, made it more likely to happen, the way plants grow toward light. What changed is that she stopped calling the arrangement an arrangement. It happened gradually. She started saying our patients instead of your patients, and then she started saying let's rather than should you, and then one evening in March she referred to the back room as my old room in the past tense, without seeming to notice she'd done it. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I thought about it later that night lying in the dark in the room that was now both of ours, and I felt something I had no word for that was not quite happiness and not quite gratitude, but was somewhere between them and deeper than either. What changed is that I told her about Catherine, not all at once, over the winter in pieces, the way you tell a thing when you're not yet sure you can trust someone with all of it, and she listened the way she listened to patients, completely, without filling the pauses, without making it about herself, without telling me what to feel about it. And one night I told her the part I hadn't told anyone, the part about sitting at the bedside and not being able to do anything, and she said, "You did the only thing that mattered. You were there." And I said that wasn't enough, and she said, to her it was, believe me. And I don't know how she knew that, but I believed her. I believed her the way you believe something when the person saying it has earned the right to say it. What changed is that the evenings were different. They had been manageable before, the evenings. Now they were something I looked forward to. The lamp, the books, the coffee, her across from me. Her voice when she was reading something she wanted to tell me about. Her hand when she reached across whatever was between us because she wanted the contact, not for any specific reason, just because it was available and she'd chosen to want it. She chose to want it. That's the thing, she chose this. Not from desperation, not because there was nothing else. She could have left. The arrangement was fulfilled. The license was confirmed. She owed me nothing in November. She could have found a situation in Cheyenne or Casper or Rawlins and had more than a 22-building town and an old doctor with too many books and a poorly made pine chest of drawers. She stayed because she decided that what was here was worth staying for. I was 61 years old. I had been alone for 11 years. I had stopped expecting anything different. And she looked at what I was, not what I'd been, not what I'd lost, not what I might have been under other circumstances. She looked at what I actually was in that small office in that small town, doing that particular work in that particular way, and she decided it was worth staying for. That is not a small thing. When you've been overlooked for so long that you've stopped expecting to be seen, when you've made your peace with being useful to people but not known by them, when you've built your life around competence because competence is the thing you can control and loneliness is the thing you can't. When all of that is the shape of your days, and then a woman with gray eyes and a direct gaze and a blue cup and margins full of bird notes decides freely that you are worth staying for. That changes things. That changes the shape of the days. I'm going to end with the spring because that's where it earned to end. In April, the snow comes off the ridge in stages and the creek runs high and brown and cold, and the grass starts coming back and the low draws first and then the hillsides go green by degrees, patchy at first and then fast, the way spring always goes fast in Wyoming like it's making up for lost time. The sky opens up after the winter, gets that particular high blue that Wyoming does in the spring, the blue that has nothing behind it, clean all the way up. The birds come back. The ferruginous hawks come first, riding the thermals over the eastern draw, and then the meadowlarks and then the small swift ones you can barely track. She was the one who spotted the first meadowlark. We were on her morning walk. I'd been joining her since February most mornings, because it turned out that an hour of cold air and sky before the day started was what I'd been missing for 11 years without knowing it. Not because I needed the air or the sky in any specific way. Because she was there, and the walk gave us that particular kind of time together that isn't about anything, isn't aimed at any task, is just two people moving through the world side by side. She stopped and tilted her head in that way she had, and she said, "There," and pointed at the wire fence along the Haverson pasture, and there was a meadowlark, yellow and black and unmistakable, and it was singing. We stood there in the April morning and listened to it. The song of a meadowlark in Wyoming in the early spring is one of those things that is better than it has any reason to be, longer and more varied than you expect, each phrase slightly different from the last, like it's working something out. She put her hand through my arm, not holding my hand, just through my arm, leaning a little, the way you do with someone you've decided to lean on and who you know won't be moved by it. The way you do when leaning is not a need but a preference, when you could stand on your own just fine and you choose this anyway. Just resting there, the meadowlark sang, the creek made its cold sound in the draw below us, the sky was that spring blue. After a while she said, "February was better than I expected." I looked at her. She was looking at the meadowlark, her profile against the morning sky, the gray at her temples, the jaw that had been set against something for a long time and hadn't let it win. She was looking at the bird, and there was something on her face that I'd seen before but not often, not the careful, composed expression she wore by default, but the one underneath it, the one that came out when she'd stopped managing for a moment and just let herself be wherever she was. She was happy. Right then, in that moment, she was simply happy. "So was March," I said, "and April's looking good." She made that sound that was almost a laugh, from somewhere real. We walked back to the office in the morning light with the cold still in the air, and the grass coming green in the low places, and the meadowlark's voice going small behind us as we moved up the street. My hand found her somewhere along the way, without either of us deciding it, and she laced her fingers into mine, and we walked like that the rest of the way home. That was Morrow Flat in the spring. That was my 22nd year there. That was the year a woman I hadn't sent for showed up with a travel bag at her feet and a direct gaze and found, in my small, ordinary life, something worth choosing. I was 61 years old. I had been alone for 11 years. I had stopped expecting anything different. I was wrong about that, about the expecting. You can be wrong about that, even at 61, even after everything. Especially after everything. The letter on a Tuesday morning smelling of pickled fish from some postal rider's lunch. The woman outside the general store taking stock of a town that had nothing to offer her except a room and a purpose, and a man who'd forgotten he was worth seeing. She saw him anyway. I want you to hold on to that.